Welcome back. This is KTN News Desk. It's a pleasure to have you here. The national budget reading is only a day away, and this afternoon on News Desk, we want to explore the prospects in the 2017-2018 2.29 trillion budget. Only 27.9% was allocated for development expenditure, and this was less than the minimum 30% threshold provided by law. And of course, we are going to explore this and more here in studio. Joining me is Fred Omondi, is a member of the Public Finance and Tax Committee at ISPAC. Thank you very much for coming into studio. And Lydia Ndirangu from Ernst & Young. Once again, thank you very much, our panelists, for joining us here for this conversation. A day to go. I want us to just quickly go back to the 2017-2018 budget and some of the specifics. How do you analyze our budget strengths as we head into the 2018-2019?
Thank you, Akisa. I think definitely we've seen the budget growing, so showing that the government is planning to spend more and more, and we are likely to see that trend this year as well, especially considering the government has already outlined its agenda, what we call the Big Four agenda. So the focus will be on spending that will lead to the realization of the Big Four agenda in the short to medium term. And if the past trend is anything to go by, then we are likely to see a bigger budget. Actually, the government has already released some estimates which show the budget will be in the region of 3 trillion Kenya shillings. So that's quite an increment from last year's budget of about 2.7 trillion shillings. So the trend is for bigger budgets, and of course then we get into the questions of how do we finance the 3 trillion shillings budget.
But I like that you've just gone straight in how are we financing it, because there's a question of the budget deficit, there's a question of collection of revenue, and the question of debt. What does this mean for us now that an upward trend continues, and of course with comparing it to 2.9 to 3 trillion, what does this mean for Kenyans?
Now, to put it simply, if we have a budget, then we have to finance it. So tax being the most significant contribution towards financing the budget means that most Kenyans will have to fork out more from their pockets to be able to finance the budget. So as long as the budget is growing, then it's expected that we'll be able to pay more in terms of taxes to be able to finance it. Of course, the other avenue that the government relies on to be able to finance the budget is debt, that is borrowing, both domestic and external debt. And in recent past, we've of course had some concerns about the level of Kenya's public debt, and so that means probably the government would like to contain the debt, and what that would mean is either we have to pay more in terms of our tax contribution, or they would have to probably look at cutting expenditure. But already seeing that the budget is growing, it means we are not looking at cutting expenditure. We are looking at raising more revenue to be able to finance the budget.
And talking about raising revenue, we've seen the government is trying to ensure that there are tax reforms to just try and finance what he says, our very big budget, and we also have a very big appetite for debt as a country. Talk to us about the tax reforms and whether you think this time round this would work for us.
So looking at the tax reform, you'll see from the several past years, the first act that was changed was the VAT Act in 2013, and then what followed was the Excise Duty Act. And then now we are seeing reforms where the Income Tax Act, which was enacted in 1974, there's going to be a revolutionized act, and they're going to issue a new Income Tax Act. And what this will mean is that when they're issuing the new Income Tax Act, they're looking at, from the bill that was actually issued for comment, it's reducing some of the incentives and then increasing certain taxes in certain threshold. And what this is geared at is to ensure there's more revenue collection. And what you'll see is, for example, in terms of the reforms that are there in the policy for the budget estimate, is that they're looking at increasing the tax net. And of concern of what people have been talking a lot about is the informal sector. And the question has been, how do we net these people in the informal sector? So there was this introduction of the presumptive tax, whereby if you're getting your business permit, you have to pay the presumptive tax at the point of getting the permit. In the past, what was there was the turnover tax, and what is going to be introduced is the presumptive tax. What this actually means is that most people now in the informal sector are going to be netted in, because by the time you're getting your permit, you will have to enter into the system.
Yeah.
So this is a move of, when people are looking at it, there's going to be an increase in the terms of the people who are going to now get into the tax bracket. And then now looking at it, there's the other question of, will it increase the cost of business? Because many people are saying, fine, this presumptive tax is going to be introduced. Is it going to increase the cost of business? Does it mean the products that these people put in the informal sector is going to actually mean that the products are going to be increased in prices? And then how does this gear up with the Big Four agenda in terms of food security and provision of more jobs and everything? So we have to look at everything from the amount of budget that we are setting, how we are going to finance it, and what's the impact to the common wananchi.
We've been seeing the Treasury trying to increase the collection of revenue. We've seen various campaigns, even from the KRA.
Yes.
But we still don't seem to be hitting the mark or meeting the targets. What do you think, from where you sit, is the missing link?
So there's been the issue of why is it that we're missing the targets, and you'll find that the areas that they actually miss the point is from the income tax, the corporation tax perspective, and the pay-as-you-earn. The one for VAT and import duty was more or less as expected, and maybe that's why even people are asking themselves, was the introduction of the 35% aimed at trying to increase the revenue? But then also you have to look at it and ask yourself, why is it that also as businesses people didn't meet their targets? Most of the listed companies and even the financial people in the financial and the insurance sector, most of them issued profit warnings. And what does it mean when an entity is actually issuing a profit warning? It actually means that they will not hit the revenue target that they hit last year. That means the corporation tax will actually reduce. So, and you'll find that there was a big electioneering period last year, and this actually meant many businesses did not hit their expected revenue. And that actually means that that's why even from the corporation tax perspective and pay-as-you-earn, people didn't get bonuses. That means less pay-as-you-earn. Yes.
But I want us to now bring in the county governments and what their role would be in tax collection. Most of the county governments, about 80% of what they collect goes to paying salaries. So you get about 20% is what is left for development ventures that will, at the end of the day, make money not just for the county, but for the country at large. I mean, how do we handle this going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe before then, just to add on to what my colleague said, in terms of collection, I think actually the Revenue Authority has done quite well, because if you look at the collection trends, they've been growing significantly, average 10% every year. But I think what we have is very ambitious targets against economic growth that is really, it's good by global standards, but then if you look at it against our projections or our, what I would call our North Star. If you remember in the Vision 2030, we are projecting to grow at about 10% or double digit to be able to achieve the goals that we set for ourselves. And currently growth is at about 4.8. This year projected maybe 5.5. So if you look at that and we have ambitious revenue targets, then the Revenue Authority has done pretty well. Of course, there are areas where they could improve in terms of maybe effectively netting the informal sector, given the structure of our economy where a lot of activity happens at the informal sector. But overall, they've done pretty well. Now, coming back to the issue of the counties, currently, as the constitution is structured, most of the revenue is collected at the national government. So the counties are left with the levies and fees on properties or certain services that they offer at the local level. So they don't have a very significant role to play unless we review the revenue sources in the first place. However, on the other hand, like you mentioned, it's about how they spend the resources that are allocated to them from the national government. And we see that a lot of it is going towards recurrent expenditure. Now, that is a concern not just at the county level, but also at the national government level in terms of our ballooning wage bill. And so what efforts would the government put in place to contain the wage bill? There have been efforts to restructure, the public sector. Whether that has worked is out, in the public domain. There are efforts to contain, for example, allowances and certain other perks that are paid to the public officers, so that serving as a public officer should be, not so much for the perks that come with it, but it should be commensurate with what we get in terms of productivity. So there is a lot still needs to be done to be able to rationalize our expenditure and to be able to contain the wage bill. There are certain aspects where probably the government is under pressure in terms of civil servants asking for review of the salaries, which yes, may not be avoided, but on the other hand, we have to look at the productivity and how do we ensure that we have the right size in terms of government. For example, one question that has to be asked, and this is probably to the Kenyan public, is whether we need all the 47 counties. And yes, that's a big question.
It's a conversation that keeps coming up and dies down.
That is it something that we can afford? And that's a big question that has to be answered by the Kenyan public themselves in terms of whether we are willing to finance, a bigger government.
What do you think?
I agree with the sentiment that Fred has shared in the sense that if we look at where we are spending our money on, most of the money is being spent on recurring expenditure. And you'll find that there's also a bit of duplication here and there. And if you're to compare based on last year's budget, you'll find that also what is increasing the cost was the fact that they had to factor in the increment for the teachers, the nurses, the doctors. Because every year we always have the demonstration where everybody in government is asking for an increased salary. And you'll find is that we have to contain this public wage bill. Because now, if you find that every time the budget is increasing and all the time it's increasing to factor in the recurring expenditure, as a country, we will not grow. And you'll find that as we're increasing, if the revenue streams are not increasing, it actually means we are incurring debt, not for infrastructure purposes, but to meet recurring expenditure, on which, as a country, we will not grow if that's how we are going to factor in our budget.
There's a question of, I just want to bring us back to the kind of debt that we have as a country right now. Most of it is being used to finance infrastructural problems. And there have been questions on whether this really does translate to gains at the end of the day. I mean, how would we address that?
Now, the debt question will always remain, as a country, then we have to ask ourselves what is a sustainable level of debt. Debt in itself is not bad, and both at individual level or even as a country, you have to sometimes borrow to be able to invest and to be able to grow. So debt in itself is not bad. I think it's the levels or the growth in our public debt that is probably worrying or is an issue of concern. And so back to your question in terms of if we are investing in infrastructure, we need to ask ourselves what is priority infrastructure and what will be able to pay back in terms of increasing the economic growth or creating more opportunities for economic activity. So if you look at some of the big infrastructure projects, we have, for example, the SGR. The question has been around how viable it is and how will it make it easier, for example, to set up manufacturing, to be able to transport goods within the country and even for export. So that's the sort of discussion we need to be having. How viable is the investment? And if we are investing in viable projects and projects that will spur economic activity, then debt can be accommodated. But if the investment does not pay off, then it will leave us with a bigger hole, and then we'll have to go back to the public to actually put in their money to be able to finance debt repayment.
And that's a problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to add on what Fred has also said in terms of looking at debt, and if you're to look at debt even from a simple approach for an individual, even that's the same way as he said from the government perspective, you'll see if you end up taking short-term loans with high interest rate compared to getting the concessionary loans, which are long-term loans with small interest rates. You'll find that if you look at our debt structure, it's slowly changing, whereby in the past we used to have the long concessionary loans, and they were more friendly, if I may say so, because they are more or less from other states. But now we are borrowing from private, can I call them private funds? And you'll find that from them, they're usually short-term, and the interest rates are a bit longer. And from what he said in terms of when we're looking at the infrastructure, we have to look look at the infrastructure and the reforms that we are putting in place. And a good move that we can see from the budget estimate is that the fact that as they are laying out the SGR plan that is going all the way to Kisumu, they're also designating the special economic zone around the SGR. That's a good move because from a manufacturing point of view, it's enabling an environment whereby you can easily manufacture your goods and easily put them on the SGR so that now it reduces your cost of business because now you don't have to think about how will I transport these goods from my hub, from a manufacturing plant, all the way to the export places like the airport or at the coast. Yes, so that's a good move in terms of we have to think about if this is the debt that we're borrowing and this is the infrastructure we are laying out, how does it play along even factoring in the private people who will come and create manufacturing hubs.
But the manner in which our debts are structured and whom we are borrowing from, is there cause for an alarm? Bearing in mind that the IMF as well gave us a red flag in terms of that?
We did get a red flag, but if you're looking at the debt to GDP ratio, currently we are around 45. And if you look at Japan, US, they're all over 100, yeah? And the question when you ask yourself, is it still under sustainable? It's still below 50%, which is still a good thing. But the question is, the issue should be at the point of repayment, do we have the funds? And fine, right now, if you look at the amount that has been allocated in terms of repayments, is around 40% has been allocated back to repayment of the debt. And the thing is, by the time that loan is crystallizing, for example, the 2 billion euro bond, when that time comes for payment, will we have the funds to pay it? If you cannot, if the time comes for payment and you do not have the funds for payment, that's when we'll be hitting the crisis mode. So but the government just has to look at and ensure that every time a loan is maturing, we have put in place funds to repay the debt so that now it doesn't reach the point for it's the time to repay. We have to borrow a more expensive loan to repay a cheaper loan.
Okay.
Yes.
I want us to take a quick break. We'll be back with a conversation. Hold on to your thoughts. Let's take a quick breather. We're still coming back with this conversation and more here on KTN News. Just don't go too far.